This is the long-awaited review of the Michael Yee Audio PA1 power amplifier, and it will be an unusual review because I'm going to talk about some experiences with it as normal reviewers review it online, and I'm going to give you a Peter Quattrup style review that is not review by reference but a review by contrast. And also I'm going to give you experiences of mine with this amplifier, which tells you more about how something can work on the long run. So what were my experiences with it? So the first time I heard this amp was about at the time when it came out. So this was probably about 15 years or so. So I remember I went to Stu's place, to the store, and I wanted to ask something of him, talk about some things about schematics and amplifiers. And then I heard that in his small room there was a new sound coming from there, and it was playing really nicely. And I asked Stu, you have a new amp, right? And he said, yeah. And I said, it sounds like a new tube amp, but it's not a Quicksilver. It doesn't sound like a CJ. What is it? And then he was just laughing, and then he said, let's go in and let's check it out. And I said, like, definitely this has tube sound. We were listening to, I think it was maybe the Z Cable test CD, and it sounded really nice. Balanced tone, good resolution, very nice dynamics. So everything was in perspective. So you have to know that Stu's small room, it had his lower systems there, like for if you were looking for a like a good deal type of systems. And in his big room, that was his big CJ room. So in the big room he had the CJ 350, which was and still is a landmark amplifier. When it came out, it was called as what did they say about it? Redefining state of the art. That's how they talked about the CJ when it came out. And true, because that solid state amplifier is a 350 watt amp. It's a much bigger amp than the Michael Yee, much heavier as well. And if you open up the chassis, it's really loaded with everything. There's not much empty space in it. But it's at a very different price class than this power amplifier, and of course it has higher resolution, higher detail. And what is really unusual from a solid state amp, that it had a pretty neutral sound. So it wasn't that harsh analog cold sound that we get from most of the audiophile solid state power amplifiers, but it was a warmer sound. But it's not warm because it's fuzzy and colored, but because it portrays recordings more as a musical experience and not as a eviscerated studio echo. So in his bigger sound room you had that more detailed, more refined sound, and I really liked that big CJ amp because it gave like a very nice experience. But it was not my preferred amp. It was not musical enough for me. But it was an excellent reference because you could grasp a lot of qualities of all the other equipments you played with it. And it had a lot of power, lot of slam, that's out of question. It was perfect. So, and most people's hearing is biased towards that you want to have lot of power and slam, and most males hearing is geared towards that. So if you have power and slam in the bass, then your hearing and your brain processes will tell you that it sounds great. But women do not hear like that. Women hear with mid-range and top-end frequencies. If it's clear for them and has the right harmonic content, then they will say it sounds good. And for them, the bass, if it's muddy, it doesn't sound good. If it's clear, it sounds good. It doesn't need to be amped up with a couple dBs, and it doesn't need to be punchy enough for most women to call it good bass. So anyway, I digress, but I want to introduce that the CJ reference, the first solid state reference against which I compared this amplifier was the CJ350. And the CJ350 playing with the big boys of the time, and the PA1 was in the small system, which was more like the $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 price category components associated with it, and playing with a bookshelf speaker. And even with that, it sounded really musical. I liked and enjoyed it much better than the CJ. And then to my huge shock, it turned out that it's a solid state amplifier. I couldn't believe my eyes, but to pop the chassis open, and then lo and behold, you see there are output transistors in it. But also the big heatsink is a really dead giveaway that it's a solid state amplifier. So anyway, that was my first experience, and I was really pleasantly surprised, and eventually, despite playing at a lower system, it had still a lot of audiophile qualities, which were like higher end qualities, a lot of transparency, clarity, a really nice frequency extension all over the board, and a clear mid-range, which is really unusual for solid state amplifiers. And even more, like the top end was nice and not as distorted as most solid state gear distorts. This, I'm not talking about gross distortion for solid state amps in the high frequency. It's more like a really fine harmonic distortion. A lot of people can't even hear it, but I'm super sensitive for that, even like the smallest amounts of it, and it just becomes unenjoyable for me. And probably that's because I listen to a lot of Baroque music, a lot of classical music, where the tonality is really important, and if you add some high frequency screech to it, music becomes completely unpalatable. But for example, if you listen to theater, some, as I say on the label, kick-ass jazz, it's Swedish jazz, I love Swedish jazz, and this might not seem to be as an immediate problem as with classical music, and most people listen to jazz and music that has like some nice impactful things like drums going around, and there people do not notice the solid state amplifier's weaknesses and failings. So nevertheless, I was really surprised that this amp did not carry the stigma of its heritage and just played beautiful music. And then over time, for the next 15 years after that, I heard this beautiful amp with many different setups and systems associated with it. It really loves Vandersteen speakers. It also loves Ryan speakers, Verities. So actually my buddy, this is his amp, he runs them with Verities, and he's really happy with the sound. He also has the CJ, the 350, and and he's saying that actually he prefers the sound of the Michael Yee over the 350 within the same system. And that's saying a lot, because that amp is several price classes higher than this amplifier. The only thing that he misses in his system with the Verity and Ryan Acoustics is that the CJ has more power and slam in the bass department. But that doesn't come up with issue with many of the music materials, but he loves drums. He's a drum freak, and for him it's essential to have like a really tight, snappy and speedy bass that can present drums of all sorts with impact and energy and immediacy. So what he's doing is that he is extending the Verity's response with his NOLA subwoofers, which are powered subs, and then he's really happy with the result. But even with that situation, he thinks that he would need a little bit more oomph than the Michael Yee PA1 can provide with 50 watts per channel. So the 3J is 350 watts, that gets the job done. However, this amp is not stock right now. I would say the circuitry and the parts, how it's used and how Michael Yee dreamed it, is the same. Nothing has been changed on the schematics. Right from the get-go, Stu has done a few modifications, and they were changing the input wires. So you see that's the input RCA jack, and the wire runs to the circuit board. So he changed that to Kimber oval copper wires, and these are really nice clear Teflon coated wires. They are really beautiful sounding. And he also changed the output, the speaker output, to the same type of Kimbers, but I think he doubled them up, and then afterwards I modified it further, but that was Stu's original mods. He usually went further with his modifications, but as his health has been failing on this unit, he hasn't done any more work, only that two parts. And then Erwin was saying that how about going all the way and doing all the mods that Stu would have done on the unit. So I added more of them, and let's see what are Stu's mods that he would do on an amplifier. And this is something that I can recommend to everyone, and to do it on every amplifier. So if you have any kind of solid state amp or even tube amp, these things are something that you should always do, and if you do it, it will elevate the sound by a class or two, and at the least it will show the character of your amplifier. So what are we talking about? So the number one issue is that when you have the input wire, that is really critical to the sound. So have it changed to high quality input wire. If you have junk RCA jacks, luckily the PA1 has good quality RCA jacks, so the jacks stayed. But if your unit comes with some cheapo or questionable looking ones, just change them to high quality RCA jacks and add a nice input wires. That will already make a big improvement with added transparency and added detail level, and it's like removing a veil or two from your system sound, and that can be beneficial if you have a good unit, if it's been designed true and well, like the PA1 has been, then you can hear more what the amp can do. But if you have a unit that has its own problems and the cheap input wire is masking those problems, then when you upgrade, you start to hear those failings. So yes, you will hear then more detail, but maybe you will start to hear graininess, some odd fine distortions, some things happening that you don't want, or the tonality might get skewed to a direction which makes music listening not fun anymore. And this can be furthered by doing the same thing for the output. And on the output, I have since changed those double runs of the thin oval Kimbers to these really heavy gauge Kimber TCX wires. These are much thicker gauge than the ovals, and I'm running 2 TCX, so double runs. I forget what's the total gauge of that, but it's pretty low, around 10 or so, or maybe even less, maybe 9, and that runs to the negative. So I doubled up to the negative, and I'm running silver wire, gauge 20 silver to the positive. And as you see, I doubled that up as well. So it's 2 runs of silver with Teflon coating and with a clockwise twist. I can't speak. And as you see, it's not 2 pieces of wire, it's a single piece of silver wire. And I wrapped it around the terminal and it's twisted together, and then it goes to the output on the board. And the thing about this is that I noticed this: if you run like 2 wires in parallel, if the ends are not connected, it's not as good as if you have a single loop. And especially silver loves this type of situation, so you double it up and keep it in a loop, so that allows the electrons to equilibrate the pressure between this end and that end at a better way. I will talk about electron flow sometimes later. I don't want this review to be endless, and I will tell later why it is a clockwise twist. It's much better than just letting them run without twisting them. For this one, I couldn't add the twist because it's a very short run, and they are really strong and heavy, and if I twist them, I cannot solder them to the board. But this one also has that extra run of silver in parallel to that heavy gauge copper. So basically on the output we have paralleled copper and silver for the ground and silver only for the positive. And the reason behind that is that we are changing it to silver, but for the ground you want to make it heavy gauge, and if you add that heavy gauge of silver, it's getting quite expensive. So I just parallel it with copper to give it that really low output impedance. And what you get is that when you have like really heavy gauge at the negative, then it gives you a lot of bass, a lot of slam, a lot of energy. And when you add silver, that gives you a nice and clean high frequency extension. And here this is a really sensitive topic, because for silver, when you start adding silver to a system, that can be truly a double-edged sword. Because if it's built properly, then you will hear that the unit handles high frequencies better than you thought. But if there are high frequency instabilities, issues, distortions, all of those will come through. because copper is really good conductor at lower frequencies, but as we climb up to higher frequencies, we are starting to see difficulties. That's another time to talk about and to mention why is that happening, but it is. So now let's see. So we have these things done to the input and the output. We have improved it, and after Stu's mods I also added extra silver on the input as well, and that's finer silver. I think that's gauge 30 silver that I parallel the input with. And now comes the new things, because you see these things like input and output wires upgraded internally. Lots of people do that. That's not something new and shocking, but this is what is new. You see that all of these capacitors, these are power supply caps here, these are the filter caps, they have this copper screen around them. So it's a layer of self-adhesive copper, and when the copper meets itself, I solder them together so that it forms a single electrical unit, and so that there is no so when you have the conductive surface here, it doesn't end there, but it's sealed. So whatever noise, whatever electricity is induced in that shield, it can get, it is picked up and grounded. I grounded it at the negative of the speaker terminal, and you see I added shields and I grounded all of them. And this is really critical for the power supply caps, because what they do is, as they filter the incoming power, and these units, as you know, in solid state amps, they we have a really high current situation. These caps stores a lot of capacitance, even though at lower voltages, much lower than tube amps, but the total amount of energy is a lot. And also, as they store energy and they fluctuate in the stored voltage and current, that fluctuation, it also creates a radiated electromagnetic field, and that those extra radiations that would leak out from the capacitors are collected by the shields and grounded. And it goes the other way around. For example, the electric field that your power transformer would radiate, it does not go into the capacitor, and it doesn't disturb its job because it's being screened by the shield. And believe it or not, screening the electrolytic capacitors takes away a lot of the failing of the electrolytic caps. So for example, if you are building an amplifier or modifying one, and you can't afford to change your electrolytics to plastic capacitors, or maybe there's not enough space for plastic because plastics would take up much bigger place than electrolytics, then just add the screen around your electrolytic cap, solder it, and then ground it, and you would go halfway towards becoming a plastic capacitor sound. And although electrolytics are this today because they are noisy, they do offer a very nice tone in general if you use like good brands of electrolytic caps. If you use like Nichicon, they have the worst tone ever. It's like a thin nasal, not very revealing sound. But if you use like Panasonic capacitors or Chemets and European capacitors in general, they have a much tougher, much tighter demands, and they are much more competitive. Their customers are much more competitive than the big US companies like Nichicon, and they are forced to keep their standards much higher. So They cost a little bit higher than the Nichicon or the other US caps, but their sound is so much better. Still, the failing of all of the electrolytics is that electrolytic noise and hush, and that can be cut down by this shielding tremendously. So I've done that to all of the big capacitors because they are the biggest radiators. And on second thing, also added the shielding to the transformers, and there's, you do not see it, but there's a double layer of shield. Is there a double layer? Maybe, I can't see it. I've done these mods 5 years ago, but the same thing is happening here. So there's a layer of copper tape, and it's being where it's met, but somewhere where it's meeting, then it's soldered together here, right here. I can't show it. Right there, it is the soldering, and then it gets grounded to the chassis. And the same thing happens for the power transformer of the other channel. It's also shielded and then grounded to the chassis. And here we have a third transformer, shielded, and I grounded it to this shield, so then it's grounded to the chassis. So these are the tweaks, and everyone can do these tweaks, and these will make your amp have a much blacker background, better dynamics, and you will hear probably better bass as well, much cleaner high ends, and much improved musicality. And with these mods, this amp is actually became more musical than the CJ with similar mods. So when you do these mods on amps, some scale up better than others, and this amp has the ability to scale up several classes when you do these modifications. So now Erwin prefers this amp to the CJ, and I prefer it too as well. And now let's look at what Mike did with the design. Oh, one more thing before we look at that, you might see that there's some things added to the capacitors and some wires added there. These were Stu's latest babies, his latest brainchild, and he passed away before he could perfect them, but after he's gone, then Wesley took up the mantle to continue it, because actually Stu started working on these with Wesley and me, and then since Wesley has perfected them, and what are these things? So these are C13 vials, and this is I mean capsules. These are the small capsules. They do not have anything else, just C13. And this one has is the vial that was Stu's latest baby. This was his first generation, and this was his latest. And this has C13 and heavy water. It's dissolved in heavy water. And then most of the viewers would think like, what on earth is going on here? What are we talking about? This will require lots of videos just to talk about the theory, talk about what's going on. But basically this is something that was Stu's idea, that he followed up based on Jack Bybee's inventions. So if you look at Bybee's, now the Bybee has a C13 devices. This is Stu's version of those C13 devices, and yes, I can say it works. And for the snake oil criers, I can also say that this is not something that is imagined. For example, dentists have been using C13 to, and not just dentists, but otherwise in the medical field, it is used to enhance radiography. So when you break your arms and they look at the x-rays, or look at the x-rays of your teeth, if you add C13 close to the display, then the resolution becomes much better, and then you can tell if what really happened with your tooth. Do you have cavities, or do you need to get it extracted, whatnot. And if you still think that's not enough, that's not real science, I can tell you that Wesley's perfected quantum bundles. That's what Stu and Wesley named them, quantum bundles. It's on the Mars rover, and it's getting to Mars. And as you know, JPL doesn't deal with anything that is like charlatan BS. And to put anything on a rocket that goes to Mars, even just a half a gram or quarter a gram, they think about it 10 times, and it has to be really substantiated. Why are we taking that to Mars? And it going to Mars, yes. Anyway, so that's like a really long thing, and I'm not going to it today. But what I'm going to today is how this amplifier works. But now I see I've been talking for 30 minutes, so it's time for the new second part of this video, and I will talk about the layout of this amp, part of the things that I understand how it works, and why it sounds so good as it does. And that will be truly useful for everyone, because it will give you pointers that when you look for an amplifier, what to look for, and when you see those features, what can you expect from an amplifier. Thank you. Bye bye.